They say that history is written by the victors, but what happens when the battle is against the planet itself? Deep beneath the freezing waters of the Weddell Sea, a wooden ship sits perfectly preserved in the darkness. It is a ghost, a monument to the greatest failure and the greatest triumph of the 20th century. Sir Ernest Shackleton promised his men honor, glory, and the conquest of the last great wilderness. Instead, he gave them a 2-year sentence in a frozen purgatory, drifting on sheets of ice that threatened to crack beneath their boots at any moment. We have all heard the legend of the escape, but the real story isn't about the journey home, it is about the waiting. It is about the nights spent listening to the hull scream as the ocean tried to crush it. It is a story of leadership in the face of absolute oblivion and the terrifying silence of a world where the sun does not rise for months. Tonight, we are peeling back the layers of the myth. We are stepping onto the ice to uncover the true human cost of the impossible. So, turn down the lights, settle in, and let the modern world fade away. Welcome to the story of the Endurance. There is a photograph that exists in the archives of history, grainy and black and white, that captures a stillness so profound it almost feels like a sound. In the image, a ship, a magnificent structure of wood and rope and ambition, sits paralyzed in a vast white void. It does not look like a vessel anymore. It looks like a toy dropped by a careless child into a field of broken glass. Around it, the horizon is flat, endless, and indifferent. If you look closely at the rigging, you can see the frost clinging to the ropes, thickening them into white cables. If you look at the hull, you can see the darkness of the water trying to chew its way in. But it is the silence of the image that haunts you. It is a silence that swallowed 28 men whole, removing them from the timeline of the living world and holding them in a frozen purgatory for nearly 2 years. This is not just a story about survival. It is a story about the waiting. It is a story about what happens to the human mind when the only thing moving in the world is the ground beneath your feet. And even that is trying to kill you. Before the ice, however, there was the noise. Before the silence of Antarctica, there was the roar of London in 1914. Imagine the smell of coal smoke and wet wool. Imagine the sound of horses' hooves clattering on cobblestones, mixing with the early rumble of motor cars and the shouting of newsboys. The world was on the edge of a precipice. The Great War was looming, a storm gathering on the continent that would soon consume millions of lives. But in the heart of this nervous, electric city, there was a different kind of recruitment happening. A different kind of war was being declared, not against a nation but against the map itself. In a small dusty office near Burlington Street, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the scratching of fountain pens. Men were lining up, not to fight in the trenches of France, but to sign away their lives for a journey to the bottom of the world. They were answering an advertisement that has since become legend, though its exact wording is lost to myth. It promised small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, and in the event of success, honor and recognition. Why did they sign? Why, when the civilized world was preparing to tear itself apart, did these men choose to walk off the edge of the known earth? They were sailors, scientists, carpenters, and photographers. Some were running away from debts, some were running away from broken hearts. But many were running toward something that modern life had stopped offering, a sense of absolute clarity. In London, life was complicated, political, grey. In the South, there was only the binary of life and death. You lived or you died, and the difference was entirely up to you. Among them walked the architect of this grand absurdity, Sir Ernest Shackleton. He was 40 years old. He was a man composed of charm, anxiety, and a terrifying amount of optimism. He was not an explorer in the dry scientific sense. He was a romantic. He was a poet who used geography as his stanza. He had been south before, twice. He had stood 88 miles from the South Pole, forced to turn back to save his men from starvation. He had tasted failure, and it tasted like ash in his mouth. He was terrified of being forgotten. He was terrified of becoming an old man, telling stories in a pub that no one wanted to hear. This expedition, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, was his final gamble. The South Pole had already been claimed by Amundsen and Scott. The race was over, the trophy was gone, so Shackleton invented a new prize. He would not just reach the pole. He would cross the entire continent, from sea to sea, walking across the white scalp of the world. It was an ambition so large it bordered on madness. It was the last great journey, he called it. He sat across the desk from these young men, looking them in the eye. He didn't ask them about their skills with a sextant or their knowledge of ice physics. He asked them if they could sing. He asked them if they had good teeth. He asked them if they could handle boredom. He was building a machine, yes, but he knew the gears of that machine were made of flesh and blood. He knew that in the long, dark winter, a man's ability to tell a joke was worth more than his ability to tie a knot. He selected 27 men. He selected a ship, a Norwegian-built barkentine specifically designed to dance with the ice. He named her the Endurance. It was a name taken from his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." It was a promise. It was a prayer. And as the supplies were loaded onto the docks, crates of pemmican, sleeping bags made of reindeer fur, scientific instruments wrapped in velvet, the name on the stern of the ship seemed to glow with a quiet, heavy significance. The departure was a spectacle. Crowds gathered. Flags waved. The king presented Shackleton with a Union Jack. But underneath the pageantry, there was a strange, melancholy undercurrent. The world they were leaving was ending. Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated. The dominoes of war were falling. By the time the Endurance slipped her moorings and drifted down the Thames, the lights of Europe were already going out. The men aboard the ship were sailing out of history and into a void. They were leaving a world of fire to enter a world of ice. As the coast of England faded into the grey mist, the mood on board shifted. The bravado of the dockside farewells evaporated, replaced by the practical rhythms of the sea. The Endurance was a beautiful ship, but she was small, 144 feet of oak and fir. She smelled of tar, unwashed bodies, and wet dog. Below decks in the hold lay the true engine of the expedition. 69 Canadian sled dogs. They were a chaotic, howling mass of muscle and fur, living in kennels built along the deck. They had names like Shakespeare, Samson, and Satan. They were not pets, they were fuel. They were the traction that would pull the sledges across the continent. The men bonded with them instantly, sensing that their lives were tied together by the invisible leash of survival. The journey south was a descent into isolation. They stopped in Buenos Aires, then South Georgia, a rugged, storm-battered island that served as the last outpost of humanity. Here the whaling station captains, men with faces carved from granite and eyes narrowed by decades of squinting at icebergs, gave Shackleton a warning. They told him the ice was bad this year. They spoke of the Weddell Sea, the body of water Shackleton intended to cross, as if it were a living beast. They said the pack ice was further north than usual. It was thick, it was aggressive. "The ice is waiting for you," one captain said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It creates its own weather. It creates its own currents. You do not sail through the Weddell Sea. You ask permission to enter." Shackleton listened. He nodded. He smiled, that charismatic, lopsided smile that had convinced wealthy backers to part with their fortunes. He thanked them for the warning, and then he gave the order to sail. This is the moment where the tragedy begins. Not with a mistake, but with a belief. Shackleton believed in his luck. He believed that boldness was a force of nature that could push back the physical world. He believed that if he just kept moving, the path would open. It was a philosophy that had served him well in the drawing rooms of London, but the Weddell Sea did not care about philosophy. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia. The last thing the men saw of the civilized world was the smoke from the whaling stations, thin grey ribbons dissolving into the sky. Then the curtain fell. For the first few days, the ocean was open. The water was the color of steel, rolling in long, heavy swells. But slowly, the texture of the world began to change. The air grew sharp, biting the inside of the nose. The light took on a strange, prismatic quality, refracting through invisible crystals suspended in the atmosphere. Then they saw it. The first piece of ice, a single white sentinel floating in the dark water. It was small, harmless, beautiful. The men rushed to the railing to take photographs. They marveled at its shape, sculpted by wind and water into a perfect, abstract form. It was a novelty, But soon, the one became many. The water began to thicken. It wasn't just liquid anymore. It was a slurry, a soup of crushed crystals. The ship had to slow down. The sound of the ocean changed from a roar to a hiss, the sound of wood rubbing against millions of floating diamonds. They had entered the pack. To understand what happened next, you must understand what sea ice is. It is not a solid sheet, like a skating rink. It is a puzzle. It is a shifting, grinding mosaic of millions of individual floes. Slabs of ice ranging from the size of a dinner table to the size of a city. These floes are constantly moving, driven by wind and current. They drift apart, opening lanes of black water called leads. And then, just as quickly, they smash together, driven by millions of tons of pressure from behind. Navigating the pack is a game of high-stakes chess. You look for a lead, a dark vein in the white armor. You steer the ship into it, pushing forward, hoping the lane doesn't close before you get through. If it closes, the ice pinches the ship. If it pinches hard enough, it crushes the hull. Shackleton stood on the bridge day and night. He watched the ice with the intensity of a hawk. He relied on the lookout in the crow's nest, a barrel strapped high up the mainmast. From there, 60 feet above the deck, a man could see the pattern of the maze. He would shout down directions, "Starboard! Port! Steady!" The Endurance lived up to her name. She was built with a hull of solid oak, over 2 feet thick in places. Her bow was reinforced with steel, shaped to ride up onto the ice and break it with her weight. She rammed the floes. She battered her way through. The sound was deafening, a constant thunder of timber striking ice, the ship shuddering from stem to stern with every impact. But it was seductive. The Antarctic summer is a time of perpetual light. The sun dips toward the horizon but never sets, bathing the world in a surreal, golden twilight that lasts for hours. The colors were impossible. Violets, pinks, deep indigos. The icebergs were not just white. They were emerald green and sapphire blue, glowing from within like lanterns. It was a cathedral of light. It was easy in those moments to forget that this place was hostile. It felt holy. The men played football on the larger floes when the ship was stuck. They took the dogs for runs. They marveled at the penguins that gathered to watch them, comical little figures in tuxedos who had never seen a human being and had no evolutional reason to fear them. It felt for a few weeks like a grand adventure. A boy's own story come to life. But the ice was breathing. That is the only way to describe it. The pack was not static. It expanded and contracted. And as January 1915 wore on, the breath of the ice began to wheeze. The temperature dropped. The leads of open water became narrower. The leads that were miles wide became yards wide. Then feet. The ship began to stop more frequently. Sometimes she would be held for an hour, sometimes for a day. The men would get out the ice chisels and saws, hacking at the frozen grip around the rudder. They would sing shanties as they worked, their breath pluming in the air. Then the pressure would ease, the lane would open, and they would steam forward again, deeper into the trap. Shackleton remained outwardly calm. He walked the deck, smoking cigarettes, chatting with the scientists, asking after the dogs. He projected an air of absolute certainty. But in the privacy of his cabin, staring at the charts, a cold knot was forming in his stomach. They were hundreds of miles from the continent. The season was turning. The summer was dying. On January 18th, a gale blew in from the northeast. It was a soft wind at first, but it carried a fatal message. It pushed the loose ice of the Weddell Sea tight against the continental shelf. It compacted the puzzle. The spaces between the floes disappeared. The water vanished. The Endurance was navigating a narrow lane between two massive fields of ice when the wind shifted. The lane began to close. It wasn't a violent slam. It was a slow, inexorable squeeze. The men on deck felt the ship lurch. Then she stopped. The engines chugged. The propeller churned the slush. But she did not move. The ice had grabbed her. At first there was no panic. This had happened before. They would wait for the wind to change, for the pressure to release. They banked the fires in the boiler room to save coal. They waited. 1 day passed, then 2, then a week. The view from the deck changed. The dark water was gone. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, was a solid, unbroken plain of white. The ship was no longer floating in water. She was embedded in rock-hard ice. She looked less like a vessel and more like a building, a strange wooden cottage erected in a wasteland. The silence returned. The engine stopped. The rhythmic thumping of the pistons, which had been the heartbeat of their world for months, fell silent. The silence of the Antarctic is heavy. It presses against your ears. It is so quiet you can hear the blood rushing in your own head. You can hear the scratch of a match on a box from across the deck. Shackleton called the men together. He did not make a speech about glory. He did not talk about the crossing. He looked at the ice, then he looked at them. "We must wait," he said. He ordered the fires extinguished completely. The Endurance was now a winter station. They rigged awnings over the deck to create an enclosed living space. They moved the dogs off the ship and onto the ice, building dog-loos, little igloos for each animal. They wired the ship for electric light, powered by a small generator. It felt cozy in a way, a floating village. But the men who knew the sea, the old salts, they walked the perimeter of the ship with worried eyes. They saw what the scientists did not. The ice was not just holding them, it was drifting. The entire pack, a mass of ice millions of square miles in size, was rotating. It was moving clockwise, dragging the ship with it. They were not stationary. They were passengers on a continental carousel, moving slowly, relentlessly away from their destination and away from safety. And the winter was coming. The Antarctic winter is not just cold, it is darkness. The sun, which had been their constant companion, began to dip below the horizon for longer periods each day. The shadows stretched. The twilight turned purple, then black. On May 1st, the sun rose for the last time. It hovered on the edge of the world, a pale, bloodless disk, and then it slipped away. It would not return for 4 months. Imagine the psychological weight of that. 4 months of night, 4 months where the only light comes from the moon, the stars, and the weak yellow glow of the ship's electric lamps. The world shrank to the pool of light cast by the Endurance. Beyond the railing, there was nothing but wind and ghosts. The temperature plummeted. 20 below zero, 30 below. The wood of the ship contracted. Nails popped out of the bulkheads with sounds like pistol shots. The metal of the tools burned bare skin. But the worst sound was the ice. As the temperature dropped and the currents shifted, the pressure in the pack increased. Millions of tons of ice were fighting for space. When two floes collided, they didn't just bump, they crushed. Massive blocks of ice weighing tons were thrust up into the air, creating chaotic mountain ranges called pressure ridges. The sound of a pressure ridge forming is like the sound of a train derailment happening in slow motion. It is a grinding, screaming roar. The men would lie in their bunks in the pitch black, listening to the ice growling outside. They could feel the vibrations through the hull. They could feel the ship trembling like an animal sensing a predator. Shackleton knew that the Endurance was strong, but he also knew that nothing made by human hands could withstand the squeeze of the Weddell Sea. If the pressure caught the ship square, if it didn't lift her up but instead squeezed her sides, she would snap like a matchstick. He began to prepare for the worst. He ordered the men to practice emergency drills. "If the ship goes, he told them, we must be ready to move in 5 minutes. Think about that, 5 minutes. 5 minutes to grab your sleeping bag, your food, your life, and jump onto a frozen, shifting ocean in the middle of the polar night, thousands of miles from the nearest human being." The men tried to keep their spirits up. They held concerts, they put on plays, they had haircuts. They celebrated Midwinter's Day with a feast, toasting the king and singing "God Save the King" into the darkness. But the fear was always there. It sat at the table with them. It slept in the bunk above them. In July, the pressure intensified. The ice began to attack. It happened in surges. The men would be eating dinner, and suddenly the ship would list violently to port. Plates would slide off the table, lamps would swing wildly. Then the groaning would start, the agonizing sound of oak beams being bent beyond their limit. The ship would cry out. Shackleton would stand on the deck, watching the ice press against the flanks of his ship. He was powerless. The man who believed he could bend reality to his will was now just a spectator. He could not fight this, he could only watch. On one particularly bad night, a storm raged. The wind screamed through the rigging, drowning out even the noise of the ice. The ship was heaved upward, listing at a crazy angle. The dogs were howling in their kennels on the ice, terrified by the shifting ground. Inside the ship, the beams were bowing inward. You could see the curvature in the walls. The support posts in the wardroom were bending like bows. The men sat in the common room, smoking their pipes, pretending to read, pretending not to hear the structural integrity of their home failing. Shackleton walked among them. He touched a man on the shoulder. He cracked a joke. He was the calm center of the storm, but his eyes were dark. He knew the geometry of the situation. The ice was closing in. The walls were narrowing. The decision to stay or go was being made for them. They were no longer explorers. They were inmates. The Endurance was no longer a ship. It was a coffin waiting to be nailed shut. And as the long polar night dragged on, the ice began to change its tactic. It stopped just squeezing. It began to twist. The floes were rotating in opposite directions, creating a shearing force. The ship was being wrung out like a wet towel. The rudder was the first thing to go. It was torn off, twisted metal and shattered wood. The stern post cracked. Water began to seep into the bilges. The pumps were manned around the clock. The sound of the pump, clank hiss, became the new rhythm of their lives. It was the sound of a clock counting down. Shackleton watched the water level in the hold rise. He watched the tired faces of his men as they worked the pumps, their breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked out at the black frozen wilderness that surrounded them. He knew that the ambition was dead. The crossing was impossible. The dream of the transcontinental journey was gone, crushed as surely as the rudder. A new objective had taken its place. It was a smaller objective, but infinitely harder. Get them home. The grand ambition had collapsed into a single, terrifying question. How do you keep 28 men alive on a sheet of ice that is drifting toward oblivion? The answer lay in the order he was about to give, an order that would strip them of their shelter, their warmth and their security, an order that would cast them out onto the ice, exposed and vulnerable. But that is the thing about survival. Sometimes to stay alive you have to leave the only safety you have ever known. You have to step off the ledge. The ice groaned. The timbers screamed. And Shackleton took a breath, the cold air filling his lungs, preparing to speak the words that would end one journey and begin another. "Get the dogs," he said. "We are going onto the ice." The death of a ship is a violent thing. We often think of shipwrecks as they appear in paintings, a mast jutting elegantly from the water, a silent tomb beneath the waves. But the death of the Endurance was not silent, and it was not elegant. It was a torture session that lasted for days. When the order to abandon ship came, it was because the vessel was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a trap. The pressure of the ice had bent the hull into shapes that wood was never meant to hold. The decks were buckled, rippling like a rug kicked by a giant. The planks were screaming. That is the only word the men used in their diaries, screaming. The sound of oak snapping under millions of tons of pressure is a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that vibrates in the teeth. Imagine standing on the leaning deck of a dying house. The lights are flickering as the generator fails. The floor is slanted at 30 degrees, slick with ice and oil. Below you, in the dark bowels of the ship, water is rushing in, black and freezing, swirling with coal dust and debris. Above you, the masts are shuddering, threatening to snap and bring down tons of rigging on your head. Shackleton stood amidst this chaos, a figure of calm in a disintegrating world. He watched as the ice drove a massive spear of frozen water through the side of the ship, piercing the hull as if it were paper. He saw the beams of the wardroom where they had eaten, laughed and toasted the king, splinter into matchsticks. He saw the sanctuary of the last 10 months being digested by the Weddell Sea. "She's going, boys," he said softly. "It's time to get off." The evacuation was a surreal migration. Men scrambled over the side, not into lifeboats, but onto the ice itself. They passed down sleeping bags, crates of food, guns, and the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. These boats, small 20-foot whalers, would soon become their only hope, but for now, they were just heavy burdens to be dragged. They set up a camp on a large floe about 100 yards from the ship. They called it dump camp. It was a chaotic pile of supplies and frightened men, lit by the eerie glow of the ship's dying lights. That night, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The men huddled in flimsy linen tents, listening to the death throes of their home. The Endurance did not sink immediately. She lingered, held up by the very ice that was crushing her, displayed like a trophy. Her stern rose into the air. Her bow was buried. She looked like a beast that had been hunted and brought down. In the morning, the realization of their position settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were 28 men standing on a floating sheet of ice, thousands of miles from civilization, with no radio, no ship, and limited supplies. The nearest human beings were whalers on South Georgia Island, over 800 miles away across the wildest ocean on Earth. Shackleton knew that morale was as critical as food. He knew that if the men looked at the wreckage of the ship too long, they would see their own graves. So he orchestrated a piece of theater. He gathered the men in the center of the floe. He stood on a packing crate, looking at them. He was wearing his parka, his breath pluming in the cold air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold cigarette case, a precious item, a symbol of the wealth and status he had left behind in London. He held it up so everyone could see the glint of gold against the white snow. Then he dropped it into the snow. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a handful of gold sovereigns. He threw them away. "Ship and stores have gone," he said, his voice flat and hard. "So now, we'll go home." He took a Bible, a gift from Queen Alexandra. He ripped out the flyleaf, the page with the Queen's inscription, and the page containing the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He folded these pages and put them in his pocket. Then he laid the heavy book on the ice. The message was brutal and clear. Everything that is not essential to survival is a burden. Gold has no value here. Sentiment has no weight here. We travel light, or we die. The men understood. They began to discard their own treasures, extra clothes, books, keepsakes. Items they had carried halfway around the world were tossed into a pile. The photographer, Frank Hurley, had to make the most painful choice of all. He dove back into the semi-submerged darkroom of the sinking ship, wading through freezing water to rescue his glass plate negatives. He emerged with hundreds of heavy glass plates. Shackleton looked at the pile. "We cannot carry them all," he said. Together they sat on the ice and smashed over 400 photographs. They kept only 120 of the best. The sound of breaking glass mingled with the groans of the ship. Every smashed plate was a memory erased, a piece of evidence lost. But it was necessary. They were shedding the past to buy a future. For the next few weeks, they lived in Ocean Camp, a makeshift village of tents pitched on a thick, sturdy floe. They were no longer sailors. They were drifters. The ice was their floor, their yard, and their captor. It is hard to convey the physical sensation of living on sea ice. It is not like camping on solid ground. The ground is alive, it moves. You can feel the ocean swell breathing beneath you, a slow, rhythmic rising and falling that creates a subtle nausea. And it is wet. The heat of the bodies inside the tents melted the surface of the ice, so they were constantly sleeping in a slushy dampness. Their sleeping bags, made of reindeer fur, began to shed. The hairs got into everything, into their food, their mouths, their eyes, and the cold. It was a physical weight. It sat on their chests. It numbed their fingers until they felt like sausages. Simple tasks like tying a shoelace or lighting a pipe became exercises in frustration and agony. But the greatest enemy was not the cold, it was the mind. Shackleton knew that in this void, the mind would eat itself. He saw the shadow of it in the eyes of his men. The polar anemia, they called it, a lethargy. Staring into the middle distance, the realization that they were insignificant specks on a hostile planet. To combat this, Shackleton became a master of routine. He enforced a strict schedule. Meals were served at precise times. The men were assigned duties, hunting for seals, repairing gear, exercising the dogs. He insisted on socialization. In the evenings, inside the smoky, cramped tents, they played cards. They read aloud from the few books they had saved. They had arguments about everything, politics, women, the best way to cook a penguin. Shackleton encouraged the noise. Silence was the enemy. Silence let the fear in. He paid particular attention to the food. He knew that a hot meal was the only thing separating a man from despair. The cook, a man named Green, performed miracles on a stove fueled by blubber. He made stews out of penguin meat, which tasted, according to the men, like beef, odorous codfish, and canvas-back duck roasted in a pot with blood and cod liver oil. It was greasy, dark, and rank, but it was hot, and it kept them alive. Milk and sugar became currencies more valuable than the gold sovereigns they had thrown away. Shackleton watched the distribution of these treats like a hawk. He knew that if one man got a slightly larger lump of sugar than another, it could spark a mutiny. In a world where everything had been taken from them, fairness was the only law left. But even Shackleton's optimism had a limit. The ice was drifting, but not where they wanted to go. They were moving north, yes, but slowly, too slowly, and the supplies were dwindling. The original plan had been to march across the ice to land. Shackleton had looked at the map and pointed to Paulet Island, where there was a known cache of stores left by a previous expedition. It was 300 miles away. A long walk, but possible. On December 23rd, they tried. They loaded the 3 lifeboats onto sledges. The boats were heavy, over a ton each. They harnessed the men into ropes like mules. They harnessed the dogs. "Forward!" Shackleton cried. It was a disaster. The surface of the pack ice was not a skating rink. It was a chaotic jumble of pressure ridges, soft snow, and hidden pools of slush. They had to hack a path through walls of ice with pickaxes. They had to drag the boats up one side of a ridge and lower them down the other, careful not to smash the hulls. Men sank up to their waists in soft snow. They slipped and fell on the jagged ice, their boots, worn thin, filled with freezing water. They sweated in the heavy parkas, then froze when they stopped to rest. The thirst was agonizing. Surrounded by water, they couldn't drink, eating snow that blistered their mouths. They marched for 7 days. They fought for every yard. At the end of a week, Shackleton took a sighting with his sextant. He did the math. He checked it again. His face went pale. In 7 days of back-breaking labor, pulling tons of wood and supplies until their hearts hammered against their ribs, they had traveled only 7 miles. But the drift of the ice, the conveyor belt they were walking on, had carried them backwards. They were further from Paulet Island than when they had started. Shackleton called a halt. He looked at the exhausted men, their faces blackened by blubber, smoke, and frostbite, their eyes hollow. He knew they could not go on. The ice was defeating them. "Strike the tents," he said. "We stop here." They pitched camp again. They called it Patience Camp. It was a name that tasted of bitterness. It was an admission of defeat. They were no longer travelers. They were cargo. They would have to wait for the ice to take them where it wanted. And as they settled into the long wait at Patience Camp, the reality of their resources began to tighten its grip. They had started with plenty of food, but the extra mouths, the mouths that did not belong to men, were becoming a liability. The dogs, they had been companions. They had been warmth on cold nights. They had names and personalities. There was Shakespeare, the leader. There was Soldier. There was Gruss, the majestic beast. The men loved them. They had shared the misery of the ice together. But the dogs required meat. Seals were becoming scarce. The penguins were migrating. There was not enough protein to feed 50 dogs and 28 men. Shackleton made the decision in private. He spoke to Wild, his second in command. The logic was cold, mathematical, and undeniable. Every pound of seal meat given to a dog was a pound of meat taken from a man who might need it to walk out of this hell. The order was given. It was done quietly. The dogs were taken behind a large hummock of ice one by one. The men who owned the teams could not do it themselves. They swapped duties. One man would take another man's dog, a pat on the head, a scratch behind the ear, a pistol shot. The sound of the shots cracked through the cold air, flat and final. The men in the tents tried to pretend they didn't hear. They tried to focus on their cards or their sewing, but every shot was a punctuation mark in a sentence they didn't want to read. But the cruelest cut was yet to come. Harry McNish, the carpenter, an older, curmudgeonly Scot who had been instrumental in saving the boats, had a cat. Mrs. Chippy. The cat was a tabby, a favorite of the crew. Mrs. Chippy would walk along the railings of the ship, unfazed by the abyss below. The cat was a touch of domesticity, a reminder of fire-lit living rooms and soft rugs. But Mrs. Chippy could not pull a sledge. Mrs. Chippy was a mouth. Shackleton ordered the cat to be shot. McNish pleaded, he argued, but Shackleton was immovable. The logic of the ice allowed for no exceptions. The cat was taken. McNish never forgave Shackleton. He wept openly. The death of the cat broke something in him, and it broke something in the crew. It was the moment they realized that the rules of the civilized world had been completely suspended. In London, you do not kill a pet because you are hungry. In Antarctica, you kill anything that threatens the equation of survival. They ate the dogs. It is a taboo that makes us shudder now. But to them, it was necessity. The meat was tough and stringy, but it was hot. They sat in their tents chewing on the muscle of the animals that had been their friends, and they did not speak of it. They just ate. Because to refuse was to die. Life at Patience Camp settled into a terrifying monotony. January turned to February, February to March. The summer was ending. The ice was deteriorating. The solid floe they were camped on began to shrink. The ocean was eating away at the edges. Cracks would appear overnight, running through the middle of the camp. Men would wake up to find a black line of water running a few feet from their tent. They would have to pack up, move the tents and settle again. The stability of the world was dissolving. Shackleton paced the perimeter of the floe. He watched the horizon. He was looking for the open ocean. He knew that eventually the pack would break up completely. When that happened, they would be cast into the boats. But if it happened too soon, while the ice was still thick and churning, the boats would be crushed. If it happened too late, they would be swept out into the vast empty Atlantic to starve. It was a timing game played with the devil. On April 8, 1916, the game ended. It happened in the evening. The swell beneath the ice suddenly increased. The floe they were living on, their home for months, split in two with a sound like a cannon shot. The crack ran directly under the tent of the sailors. Men scrambled out, pulling their sleeping bags from the widening fissure. The dark water boiled up between the halves of the ice. Shackleton shouted orders. "Launch the boats, get the stores!" Panic, for the first time, threatened to take hold. This was not a drill. The ground was literally falling apart beneath their feet. They threw the crates of pemmican into the boats. They threw the sleeping bags in. The dogs that remained were shot quickly, their bodies left on the ice. The three boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, slid into the water. They were small, so incredibly small, 22 feet long, open to the air. Loaded with men and gear, they had only a few inches of freeboard. The water was right there, lapping at the gunwales. The men climbed in. They grabbed the oars. For over a year, they had been creatures of the land. They had walked, sledged, and camped. Now they were sailors again. But the sea they entered was not a sea of water. It was a chaotic slurry of smashing ice and freezing spray. Shackleton stood in the stern of the James Caird. He looked back at the campsite. The stained snow, the abandoned gear, the blood of the dogs. It was a miserable stain on the white purity of the Antarctic. He turned his face to the north. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. The temperature was dropping. "Push off," he said. The oars dipped into the black water. The boats moved away from the floe. They were afloat. But they were not safe. They were now at the mercy of the wind and the waves. In 3 nutshells of wood heading into the dark. The waiting was over. The running had begun, and the ocean, which had been denied its prize for so long, opened its mouth to receive them. The silence of the ice was replaced by the roar of the surf, and the real trial, the trial of wetness, of thirst, of sleeplessness, was about to begin. The grand ambition was long dead. The reality was a wet sleeping bag and a thirst that burned like fire. And the machine of the expedition had been stripped down to its final gear, the will to live. If the ice had been a prison, the ocean was an executioner. When the 3 boats pushed away from the disintegrating floe, the men entered a world of violence that is difficult for a modern mind to comprehend. We are used to the ocean as a place of leisure, or perhaps a place of transit viewed from the safe height of a cruise ship deck. But in a 22-foot rowboat in the middle of the Antarctic autumn, the ocean is a mountain range in constant motion. The waves were not just water, they were walls. They rose 20 feet above the heads of the men, blocking out the sky, grey and terrifying. When the boat slid down into the troughs between these waves, The rest of the world disappeared. There was only the green-black wall of water ahead and the green-black wall of water behind. They were in a valley of death, over and over again. The temperature plummeted. The spray from the oars did not just wet them, it froze instantly upon contact with their clothes. Within hours, the men were encased in armor of ice. Their parkas became stiff, crackling shells. To move an arm was to break the seal of frost, letting the biting wind find the warm, damp skin underneath. And it was dark. The nights were long, stretching out for 12-14 hours. In the darkness, the terror was amplified. They could not see the waves coming. They could only hear the roar, like a freight train approaching in the dark, and then feel the boat lift, shudder and crash down. Shackleton in the James Caird led the way. He stood in the stern, his beard matted with ice, shouting orders that were immediately torn away by the wind. He was navigating by instinct, as much as by sight. He knew that if the three boats were separated, it was a death sentence. So they tied themselves together with a line, a fragile umbilical cord stretching through the storm. But the line was a liability. The Stancombe Wills, the smallest and heaviest of the boats, dragged like an anchor. It took on water. The men inside sat in freezing slush up to their knees, bailing frantically with pots, sleeping bags, anything they could find. They were rowing for their lives, not to get somewhere, but simply to keep the boat's nose into the waves. If they turned broadside, they would flip. If they flipped, they died. It was that simple. Thirst became the new torture. They had left the ice so quickly they had taken very little fresh water. They had assumed they could melt ice chunks as they went, but in the violent tossing of the boats, lighting a stove was impossible, and the sea around them was salt. Their mouths dried out. Their tongues swelled until they filled their mouths, making speech difficult. They began to hallucinate. Men pointed at the horizon, claiming they saw lights, houses, warm fires. They tried to drink the seawater, and their comrades had to strike the cups from their hands. For 7 days, they existed in this purgatory. They did not sleep. To sleep was to freeze. They huddled together for warmth, a mass of shivering, groaning bodies. The salt spray ate at their eyes, blinding them with inflammation. They were not men anymore. They were biological machines operating on the very last reserves of fuel. Then, through the grey mist, a shape emerged. It was not a hallucination. It was hard, black and jagged. Cliffs rising sheer from the water, glaciers spilling down into the surf. Elephant Island. It was not a salvation. It was a rock, a desolate, wind-swept peak of the ocean floor, jutting out of the Atlantic. It had no trees, no shelter, no inhabitants. It was a place where seals went to die. But to these men, it was the Garden of Eden. The landing was chaotic. The surf pounded the rocky beach. The men, their legs atrophied from a week of crouching in the boats, collapsed as soon as they stepped onto the stones. They crawled on their hands and knees above the high water line. They fell face down into a small stream of glacial meltwater, drinking like animals, lapping up the muddy, icy water until they vomited, and then drinking again. They had done the impossible. They had escaped the ice. They were on solid ground. But as the adrenaline faded, the reality of Elephant Island set in. They were standing on a narrow spit of beach, backed by unclimbable cliffs and fronted by a violent sea. The wind howled down from the glaciers, carrying razor-sharp grit that scoured their faces. There was no wood to build a cabin. There was no game to hunt, save for a few penguins that looked at them with suspicion. They were alive, yes, but they were trapped. They had traded a drifting prison for a stationary tomb. Shackleton walked the length of the beach. It took him 10 minutes. He looked at the faces of his crew. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their skin grey and covered in salt sores. Some were suffering from frostbite, their toes turning black and hard. One man, the young stowaway Perce Blackborough, could not walk at all. Shackleton knew that no ship would ever come here. Elephant Island was far away from the shipping lanes. It was a blank spot on the map. If they stayed here, they would starve, they would freeze, they would die one by one, and the snow would cover their bones, and no one would ever know what happened to the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition. There was only one choice, and it was a choice so reckless, so terrified in its audacity, that it seems like a myth. Someone had to go for help. The nearest outpost of humanity was the whaling stations on South Georgia Island. It was 800 miles away. To get there, a boat would have to cross the Scotia Sea, the most turbulent stretch of ocean on the planet. It is an area known as the Drake Passage, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide, creating waves that are regularly 60 feet high. Winds of 80 miles an hour are common, and they would have to do it in a 22-foot lifeboat. Shackleton did not order anyone to go. He volunteered himself. He asked for volunteers to join him. Every man stepped forward, but Shackleton chose carefully. He needed the best sailor, Frank Worsley, a man who could navigate by the stars while bobbing like a cork in a hurricane. He needed strength, Tom Crean, the giant Irishman who was indestructible. He needed the carpenter, Chippy McNish, and 2 others, McCarthy and Vincent. 6 men. The preparation of the James Caird began immediately. It was an act of desperation disguised as engineering. McNish, the carpenter, used the wood from the packing crates and the runners of the sledges to build a makeshift deck over the open boat. He sealed the seams with lampwick and seal blood. It was a flimsy lid on a coffin. They loaded the boat with rocks for ballast. They put in water casks, sleeping bags, and a month's worth of rations. The boat sat low in the water, heavy and sluggish. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, the crew gathered on the beach. The mood was not celebratory. It was funereal. The 22 men who were staying behind stood in a line, shaking hands with the 6 who were leaving. They looked at Shackleton with a mixture of reverence and pity. They knew the odds. They knew that a 22-foot boat had no business in the Southern Ocean. They were saying goodbye to a ghost. Shackleton climbed into the boat. He looked back at the men on the beach. He saw Frank Wild, his second-in-command, a small, tough man who would be in charge of the castaways. "Look after them, Frank," Shackleton said. "I will, boss," Wild replied. The James Caird was pushed into the surf. The men on the beach watched as it crested the first wave, then the second. It grew smaller and smaller, a tiny speck of wood bobbing against the grey vastness of the horizon, and then it was gone. The men on the beach turned back to the island. The silence returned. But this time, it was different. The noise of the leader, the energy of Shackleton was gone. They were alone. This is the part of the story that is often glossed over. We focus on the heroic voyage of the James Caird, battling the hurricanes. But the true horror, the true test of endurance was happening on that beach. Frank Wild was now the commander of 21 starving, freezing, terrified men. He was not a charismatic orator like Shackleton. He was a quiet man, a practical man. He knew that his job was not to inspire them to greatness, but to keep them from sliding into madness. Their home was an overturned boat. They took the 2 remaining lifeboats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills, and flipped them over on top of 2 low stone walls they built. They draped canvas over the gaps. This was the snuggery. It was a hovel. It was dark, windowless, and cramped. It smelled of unwashed bodies, rotting seal meat, and tobacco smoke. It was so low that a man could not stand up inside. They had to crawl over each other to move. When the blubber stove was lit, the air filled with greasy, black soot that coated their lungs and blackened their faces until they looked like coal miners. In this dark hole, 22 men lay side by side, packed like sardines. Condensation dripped from the roof. The floor was wet stones and guano. Wild established a routine. It was the only defense against the crushing weight of time. Every morning he would issue the order, lash up and stow. The men would roll up their sodden sleeping bags. They would tidy the hovel. Then Wild would walk to the flap of the tent, look out at the empty grey ocean, and say, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. Shackleton had been gone for a week, then 2, then a month. It was impossible for him to return that quickly, but they clung to the lie. It was a ritual. It was a prayer. They hunted penguins. When the penguins were gone, they dug up old seal carcasses from the snow, meat that was green and putrid, and boiled it. They ate limpets pried from the rocks. They boiled seaweed. Starvation changes a man. It eats the fat, then the muscle, then the mind. They became lethargic. They stopped talking. They lay in their bags for 20 hours a day, dreaming of food. They described meals to each other in pornographic detail: roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, hot tea with sugar, and the physical decay set in. Perce Blackborough's feet were rotting. The frostbite had turned to gangrene. The toes were black, dead charcoal attached to living flesh. The smell was unbearable. The doctors, Macklin and McElroy, knew they had to act. They had no hospital. They had no sterile instruments. They had a pocket knife and a few ounces of chloroform they had saved from the ship. They heated the hut as best they could, burning the last of the blubber. They laid Blackborough on a crate. They put the mask over his face. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, under the flickering light of a blubber lamp, they cut off his toes. They threw the blackened pieces of bone and flesh into the stove. The men watched. They saw their own vulnerability on that table. They saw how easily the human body could be dismantled by the cold. June came. The depths of winter. The sun barely rose. The island was buried in snow. The beach shrank as the tides shifted. Sometimes the waves would wash right up to the door of the hut, threatening to sweep them away. They were living on the edge of a razor. Behind them, the glacier would calve, sending tons of ice crashing down onto the beach, shaking the ground. In front of them, the ocean roared, and the doubt began to creep in. It started as a whisper, a glance, a silence that lasted too long. "He's not coming back." The Cairds sank. The ocean took them. They tried to push the thoughts away, but the math was against them. It had been 6 weeks, then 8 weeks, then 3 months. The James Caird was a splinter. The Southern Ocean was a hammer. It was statistically impossible for them to have survived. Frank Wilde fought the despair with everything he had. He kept the routine. "The boss may come today." But his voice was growing thinner. The men could see the worry in his eyes. They began to prepare for the end. They wrote letters to their families, sealing them in tins, hoping that maybe, years from now, a whaler would find their skeletons and their notes. They made pacts. "If I die, eat my ration. If I die, take my diary." August arrived. The shoreline was choked with ice again. The pack had returned. Even if a ship came, it couldn't get through. They were sealed in. The food was almost gone. They were digging up the backbone of a seal they had discarded months ago, boiling the bones for broth. They were skeletons in rags, huddled in the dark, listening to the wind. August 30th, 1916. It was a day like any other. Grey, cold, windy. The men were preparing lunch, a stew of boiled seaweed and a few scraps of seal. George Marston, the artist, crawled out of the hut to gather some ice for the pot. He stood up, shielding his eyes against the stinging snow. He looked out at the horizon, a habit that had become meaningless. He saw something, a shape. Not a berg, not a cloud, a hard, dark line. Smoke. He stood frozen. His brain refused to process it. He thought he was hallucinating, like the men in the boats who saw fires on the water. He squinted. The shape moved. It was a ship, a small steamer battling through the ice. Marston didn't shout. He couldn't. His throat seized up. He crawled back into the hut. "Wilde," he rasped. "Wilde." "What is it?" Wilde asked, annoyed at the interruption. "There's a ship," Marston whispered. "There's a ship." Wilde looked at him. He saw the look in Marston's eyes. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Wilde scrambled out of the hut. He kicked the other men. "Get up! Get up!" They poured out onto the beach. They looked. There, a mile offshore, was a small rusted tugboat. The Chilean flag was flying from the mast, and on the bridge, looking through a pair of binoculars, was a figure. A broad, heavy-set figure. It was Shackleton. He had come. The sound that erupted from the beach was not a cheer. It was a primal scream. It was the sound of men who had been dead returning to life. They waved their rags. They fell to their knees. They wept. Shackleton lowered a boat. He came ashore. As he stepped onto the pebbles, the men did not run to him. They stood still, awestruck. He looked older. His face was lined with the exhaustion that went down to the bone. But he was there. He looked at Wilde. He didn't ask about the food. He didn't ask about the weather. He asked the only question that mattered. "Are you all well?" Wilde straightened his back. He looked at the ragged, starving scarecrows behind him. "All safe, boss," he said. "All safe." It wasn't entirely true. Blackborough was missing toes. Others were half dead. But they were alive. Not one man had died on the beach. Shackleton didn't smile. He nodded. The relief in his eyes was like a physical collapse. "Get in the boat," he said. "The ice is closing." The evacuation was frantic. There was no time for sentiment. No time to pack the diaries or the geological specimens. They grabbed what they could and scrambled into the lifeboat. They left the hut. They left the pile of seal bones. They left the desolate beach that had been their home, their prison, and their graveyard for 4 months. As the lifeboat pulled away, heading toward the steamer, the Yelcho, the men looked back at Elephant Island. It looked small now, just a rock in the water, a jagged tooth. They were leaving. But they were leaving something of themselves behind. The innocence of the pre-war world. The belief that nature was something to be conquered. That was gone. They climbed the ladder of the Yelcho. They were pulled onto the deck by Chilean sailors who looked at them with horror and amazement. They smelled like death. They looked like monsters. But as the steamer turned and headed north away from the white hell, the men of the Endurance did something strange. They didn't go below to the warm cabins. They didn't go to the galley for food. They stood at the rail. They watched the ice recede. They watched the white line of the pack fade into the grey mist. They watched until their eyes watered, until the cold bit through their rags. They were watching the beast that had tried to eat them, and they were watching it starve. The grand ambition was over. The reality had been endured. The crisis had broken. Now, all that was left was the echo. The return to a world that had forgotten them, a world that had found its own way to destroy itself while they were sleeping on the ice. They were going home. But they didn't know yet that home was no longer there. The transition from the ice to the world of men is not a simple crossing of a line. It is a decompression. If you ascend too quickly from the deep ocean, the nitrogen in your blood boils. If you ascend too quickly from the silence of the Weddell Sea to the noise of civilization, the soul gets the bends. On the deck of the Yelcho, as the coast of Elephant Island dissolved into the mist, the men of the Endurance experienced a sensation that was almost violent in its strangeness. Warmth. Not the fleeting warmth of a momentary sunbeam or a cup of weak tea, but a systemic, industrial warmth radiating from the ship's engines. It felt alien. It made their skin prickle. They were given cigarettes. They were given bread. These simple objects, mass-produced and commonplace, felt like artifacts from a lost civilization. A loaf of bread was a miracle of engineering, soft, dry, smelling of yeast and life. A cigarette was a tube of pure luxury. They held these things with trembling hands, afraid that if they squeezed too hard the illusion would shatter, and they would wake up back in the snuggery, huddled under the overturned boats, with the smell of rotting seal fat in their noses. The Chilean sailors looked at them with a mixture of horror and awe. They were bearded, filthy, their skin stained black by blubber smoke, their clothes stiff with grease and blood. They looked like creatures dredged up from the seabed. They did not speak much. The language of the ice, a language of grunts, simple commands, and silence, was still the only tongue they knew. When they arrived in Punta Arenas, the southernmost city in Chile, the world greeted them not as men but as resurrections. The crowds that lined the docks were silent at first, then erupted. To the people of the South who knew the cruelty of the Antarctic, this was a biblical event. Men who go into the white silence do not come back. And yet, here they were, all of them. Shackleton stood at the prow, the architect of their survival. He was exhausted, his face aged 10 years in 2. But he played the part. He waved. He smiled. The machine of leadership, which he had kept running on fumes for 22 months, had one final gear to turn: the return. But as the initial euphoria of hot baths, clean sheets, and steak dinners faded, a new reality began to set in. They had left England in 1914. It was now late 1916. They had been frozen in time while the rest of the world had been burning. They asked for news. They expected to hear about border skirmishes, perhaps a treaty signing, the usual diplomatic shuffling of Europe. Instead, they were handed newspapers that read like obituaries for the human race: the Somme, Verdun, Ypres. Names they did not know, Places that had been sleepy villages when they left were now synonymous with industrial slaughter. They read about machine guns, poison gas trench warfare. They learned that millions of young men, the very generation they belonged to, had been fed into a meat grinder while they were playing football on the ice floes. It was a psychological whiplash that is hard to imagine. They had spent 2 years fighting to save 28 lives. They had agonized over a single frostbitten toe. They had mourned a cat. They had treated life as a precious, fragile diamond that had to be protected at all costs. And they returned to a world that was spending lives like copper coins. The irony was suffocating. Shackleton had saved them from the ice, only to deliver them to the fire. Almost immediately the crew dispersed. There was no time for a victory lap. The war machine needed meat, and these men were survivors. They were tough. They were useful. Tim McCarthy, the young Irish sailor who had sat in the James Caird with Shackleton, enduring the worst ocean voyage in history, surviving hurricanes and thirst, signed up for the Royal Navy. 3 months later, his ship was torpedoed in the Channel. He died at his gun post. The Southern Ocean couldn't kill him, but a German submarine did. Alfred Cheetham, the cheerful third officer, who had been the backbone of the morale on the ice, was killed when his minesweeper was blown up a few weeks before the war ended. It felt like a dark joke. The miracle of the ice was being undone, man by man, by the machinery of war. And for those who survived the trenches, the return to civilian life was a different kind of struggle. They carried 2 silences within them now, the silence of the Antarctic and the silence of the Western Front. They were heroes, yes. The press called them that. Shackleton was knighted again. He went on lecture tours. He stood on stages in London and New York, projecting lantern slides of the ship being crushed, telling the story of the open boat journey. The audiences gasped. They applauded, but the applause felt hollow. How do you explain the feeling of the ice to a room full of people wearing dinner jackets? How do you explain the sound of a pressure ridge screaming in the night to a woman who is worried about the rationing of sugar? You don't. You simplify. You turn the trauma into an adventure story. You turn the starvation into a bit of a hungry patch. You turn the terror into pluck. Shackleton became a myth during his own lifetime. He was the symbol of British endurance, the man who kept calm and carried on. But the man himself was broken. He could not settle. The domestic life, the life of bills and taxes and business deals, was a cage he did not know how to open. He drank. He had affairs. He invested in schemes that failed. He was a lion trying to live in a dollhouse. He missed the ice. It sounds insane, doesn't it? To miss the place that tried to kill you. To miss the cold that turned your feet black. But on the ice, life was simple. The objective was clear. Stay alive. The enemy was honest. The weather. In London, the enemies were vague. Boredom, irrelevance, debt. In 1921, 5 years after the rescue, Shackleton organized another expedition. The Quest. It was a vague mission to circumnavigate Antarctica, to find some islands, to do something. It didn't really matter what. He just needed to go back. Many of the old Endurance crew signed up. Wild, Worsley, Green, the cook, Macklin, the doctor. They were drawn back to him like moths to a dying flame. They knew he was a disaster with money. They knew he was disorganized, but they also knew that on the ice he was a god, and they missed the clarity of his church. The Quest sailed south, but the machine was finally breaking down. Shackleton was not the man he was in 1914. His heart was tired. He had pains in his chest that he dismissed as indigestion. He drank too much champagne to numb the anxiety. On January 5, 1922, the Quest arrived at South Georgia Island, the same island where the Endurance saga had begun. The circle was closing. That night, Shackleton wrote in his diary, "The old smell of dead whale permeates everything. It is a strange and curious place, a wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover gem-like above the bay." A few hours later, he suffered a massive heart attack. Dr. Macklin, the man who had cut off Blackbro's toes on Elephant Island, rushed to his cabin, but there was nothing to be done. The boss was gone. He was 47 years old. They did not bring his body back to England. His wife, Emily, sent a message. He belongs to the South. They buried him on South Georgia, in the whalers' cemetery at Grytviken. His grave faces south, toward the continent he never crossed, toward the ice that defined his life. And what of the others? What of the legacy of the men who waited? History has a way of smoothing out the rough edges of reality. We tell the story of Shackleton as a seamless narrative of heroism. We focus on the boat journey. We focus on the not a life lost statistic. But we forget the cost. We forget Harry McNish, the carpenter, the man who saved the boats, the man who argued with Shackleton on the ice, who defied him briefly, who was shot through with bitterness over the death of his cat. When Shackleton returned and recommended his men for the Polar Medal, he deliberately excluded McNish. He stripped the man of his honor because of a moment of insubordination, born of despair. McNish died in poverty in New Zealand, an old man sleeping in the shed of the docks, bitter and forgotten. It took decades for history to forgive him, for a statue of his cat, Mrs. Chippy, to be placed on his grave. We forget the mental toll. The polar anemia never really left some of them. They were marked men. They had seen the edge of the world, and once you have seen the edge, the center never feels quite solid again. But the story endures. Why? Why, over a century later, are we still obsessed with a failed expedition? They didn't discover anything. They didn't cross the continent. They lost their ship. By all metrics of the time, it was a disaster. We remember it because it is the ultimate story of the one thing we all must eventually face: failure. Most adventure stories are about conquest. They are about planting a flag. They are about imposing human will upon the chaos of nature. The story of the Endurance is the opposite. It is a story about submission. It is a story about accepting that you are not the master of the world. Shackleton failed to cross Antarctica, but in doing so he succeeded in something far more difficult. He succeeded in remaining human in a place that strips humanity away. He threw away the gold to keep the banjo. He shot the dogs to save the men. He chose life over legacy. And in doing so, he secured the greatest legacy of all. But the deepest lesson of the ice is not about Shackleton. It is about the waiting. We live in a culture of action. We solve problems by moving, by building, by fighting. We are uncomfortable with stillness. We view waiting as wasted time. But the men of the Endurance teach us that waiting is an action. Think of them on the Floes. Think of them in the snuggery on Elephant Island. They could not fight the ice. They could not fight the wind. They could only wait. But their waiting was not passive. It was a ferocious, active thing. It required a daily renewal of faith. They had to wake up every morning in the dark, cold and wet, and decide to believe that they would not die that day. They had to decide to be kind to the man next to them, even though they hated the way he chewed his food. They had to decide to polish their boots, even though they were going nowhere. That is the hardest work a human being can do. To maintain order when the world is chaos. To maintain hope when the data says there is none. In the end, the ice melted. It always does. The seasons turned. The ship came. But the men who stepped onto that rescue boat were not the same men who had sailed south. They carried the ice inside them. If you go to Antarctica today, you can still feel it. The silence is still there. The glaciers still carve into the sea with the sound of thunder. The wind still screams off the plateau. And if you look down into the dark waters of the Weddell Sea, 3,000 meters down, lies the wreck of the Endurance. It was found in 2022, perfectly preserved by the cold, dark water. The name is still clearly visible on the stern. Endurance. It sits there in the darkness, a monument to the grand ambition and the crushing reality. It is a ghost ship in a frozen underworld. But the spirit of the expedition is not in the wood and iron at the bottom of the sea. It is in the echo of the order that Frank Wilde gave every morning on that desolate beach, the order that kept 22 men alive when they had every reason to die. Lash up and stow, boys. The boss may come today. It is the promise that no matter how dark the night, no matter how thick the ice, if you can just hold on, if you can just endure, the ship will come. The horizon is not empty, it is just waiting for the right moment to reveal the sail.